Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 37 of the Capitalist Corner. I'm your host, Mark Pellegrino, and the chairman of the American Capitalist Party that you can find on americancapitalistparty.org, along with my co-chair and co-host, Michael Liebowitz, who is also the host of his own show, The Rational Egoist. Today, we're going to talk about news as usual, but we're going to talk about debates first because Dave Smith, the infamous Dave Smith, somewhat a self-proclaimed head of libertarianism, had a debate recently at Soho Forum about immigration, whether or not it was contrary to libertarian principles to regulate immigration. And taking the other side was who was the character's name?
Alex Nowrasteh.
Alex Nowrasteh. I only saw 5 minutes of the debate and a question that Michael asked about an hour and a half into it, which Dave couldn't answer, of course. But Michael was there at the Soho Forum, so he's going to give us a full update, and we're going to talk about it from a capitalist perspective, since Soho Forum is largely libertarian in nature. I doubt they addressed it in the same way that we did. Maybe Alex did. But Dave certainly didn't.
No. So first of all, let me just say, what a great time. I mean, as someone who's just starting to do a little traveling in my life, just to go, I've been to Manhattan several times, but this is my first time in Soho, and it was a great experience. We met with Dave Goodman, who's an objectivist that I know from Facebook. Had lunch with him, did some nice talking. It was great. Went to the down in Soho, we ran into the comedian Jim Gaffigan was there.
Did you talk to him?
Subby did. I would have never recognized him, but my friend Subby loves him. It's like his favorite comedian. So he said, Jim Gaffigan, he talked to him. It was really nice. And let me just say, Gene Epstein, the host of the Soho Forum, is an absolute treasure. I mean, he's a libertarian, ANCAP, whatever. He's a great guy, very friendly, very funny. I interviewed him on my show, and when I interviewed him, he said, because you had me on, you can have tickets to any Soho event that you want to go to. And then when I saw that Alex Nowrasteh was going to debate Dave, because I really like Alex, I said, okay, I got to go to this. So it was great. Just standing outside, waiting to get in, talking to people was nice. Alex Nowrasteh comes by. I started talking to him, and I get in, and I walk, and I see Gene Epstein, and he looks at me, and he says, "Hey," and he makes a joke. He says, "Does your probation officer know you're here?" And my friend Subby said it would be his parole officer, actually. It was fun. And then Dave Smith comes by, and I told Gene, I said, "Hey, introduce me to him." And, he begins to tell Dave who I am. And Dave says, "I know, we've had interactions, on Twitter." I said, "Yeah, but I'm nicer in person." He said, "Well, we all are." And look, he was respectful. I'm not going to bash Dave. I talked to him a little bit throughout the night. He was very respectful, although we disagree. After the debate, I told him, I said, "Listen, I think you lost," which I do. I said, "But he did do better than I thought he would do," which is also true. So Dave's, I want to talk about this on a few levels, Mark. I want to talk about it from the substance of this debate, but also about debates in general. So this debate is what they call a Oxford style debate. Now, what that means is that they poll the audience beforehand and ask for their perspective or ask their position on the given proposition. The proposition for this debate was, from a libertarian perspective, does it make sense for the government to restrict, and this is vital for this now, for the government to restrict peaceful and healthy people from coming into the country, right? So you have to understand, you cannot then turn around and argue, well, immigrants are dangerous or immigrants are going to pass diseases around, because that's excluded from the subject matter by the proposition. So Dave opens up, and it's important because his position is slightly more nuanced than how I think it's being interpreted. It's not simply because what he says is, look, 95% of the American people oppose open immigration of this type. And it seems like it's just a raw appeal to democracy, but it's not. That's not the principle he's aiming at, although that might be what it turns into. The basic idea that he's getting at is that the government has property in the country, and the government basically has stolen that property and finances it with the tax dollars that it steals from the citizens of the country. So Dave's point is that if the taxpayers of the country have been fleeced, which he's right about this, to pay for this property, then it's the taxpayers that ought to have a say, because otherwise you're violating the principle of voluntarism that's central to libertarianism, because you're forcing association. So that's his fundamental argument. Now, I have a lot of problems with his analogy and with his argument, because, okay, first of all, if 95% of the people oppose it, that means that 5% are for it. So what about their rights? Now, if this was a situation we were all voluntary joint stockholders of a corporation where we've agreed to decide by majority vote, then it would make sense to govern the corporation or the company or the neighborhood, whatever. But this is a situation where people are forced to contribute. They're not voluntarily signing up to a joint enterprise. So what about the rights of the 5%? What about the rights of the tavern owner who wants to hire immigrants or who wants to serve immigrants, right? There's also the case that Dave's premise will lead ultimately to conclusions that I don't think he nor most libertarians would accept. That doesn't render the premise false. It does mean there's a contradiction built in. You'd still have to demonstrate the premise is false, but in this case, we can demonstrate there's contradictions. For instance, as I pointed out to an anarchist that I was talking to last night, I don't live in New York, right? New York roads, New York cops, the entire New York infrastructure is paid for by New Yorkers. I don't pay for it as a resident of Connecticut. It's not paid for with federal taxes. So by Dave's logic, the people of New York could stop me from coming in. They could say, we don't want anybody from Connecticut coming in. This is our land. They don't have a right to travel on our roads, on our subway, to walk on our sidewalks. And I don't think there's a libertarian in the world who would favor that. You also have the case where libertarians favor legalization of all drugs. In most cases, I'm sure you could find the exception, but that's generally a libertarian position. Okay, well, what if the people say they don't want heroin to be transported on their roads, on their sidewalks, through their neighborhoods? Again, you run into a situation where the premise leads to conclusions that libertarians won't accept. And what about local zoning laws, which is actually one of the articles that I sent you had to do with local zoning. But by this logic, if we live in a neighborhood and we support zoning laws, and somebody wants to sell their property to somebody outside that hasn't been paying taxes in the neighborhood, right? So it's jointly owned, the neighborhood, then you couldn't sell your property to somebody that wants to come in and do with his property or her property what they want, because the owners of the community say no. So I really think that Dave's argument falls apart. Now, Alex came.
Can I interrupt for a second?
Sure.
It's not an argument against immigration. It's an argument against state ownership of property. It's an it's
yes.
So he's doing a bait and switch in essence. Now, I just heard the first 5 minutes of his presentation, and the fact, one, that he premised his argument on voluntarism as sort of the animating moral principle behind which libertarians coalesce, disturbed me. Automatically, it took free movement of human beings out of the realm of individual rights and put it into the realm of this, we have consensual relationships, and because there's public property and we pay for these things, then the majority of people have a right to, make claims against those with whom they are forced to associate. I mean, so on multiple levels, Dave's argument denied individual rights, denied the right of free movement of people, and instead claimed the argument against government ownership of anything in lieu of an argument against immigration. And yes. At some point, Nowrasteh pointed out that's an argument for privatization.
He pointed it out in relation to schools, and what he did is he said, look, Ludwig von Mises effectively argued that controls breed more controls. And the thing to do is to stop controls and go the other way. So Dave's response, and this is one of the arguments that I just hate, because in the realm of politics, we're arguing for what should be, right? But Dave says, well, we have to live in reality. Well, the reality is the vast majority of people oppose drug legalization. The reality is the vast majority of people oppose privatization of all schooling. You know what I mean? So there's a lot of things that the vast majority of people are not going to go for, and that we ultimately have to convince them with our arguments. And you don't do that by buying into the idea, well, 95%, if that's even true. I mean, I don't know the number, but it seems like it was accurate from the little bit I looked into it. But Alex came prepared with facts, the fact that, immigrants are not a drain on the system, that they're not prone to crime, that they come here for a better life, that it's the right of the people of America to deal with them if they want. If the majority don't want to, that is not, it's not relevant. If Mark doesn't want me to associate with, say, Nicole Hingle, and Mark and 50 of his friends all vote that I can't associate with her, it's up to Nicole and I to decide if we want to associate. Right? We're the individuals. And over again, Alex demonstrated that the market. Now, of course, Scott chimes in. Dave's making a valid argument. No, he's not, Scott. A valid argument doesn't entail contradictions. Dave does. So it's not valid. It's invalid by definition of what a logical argument is. And nobody, hold on just 1 second. And nobody's saying you don't start where you're at. But when you start where you're at, then you put forth a plan to get where you want to go. You say, okay, I want full legalization of all drugs. For now, I'll settle for the legalization of marijuana. For instance, I personally want the abolition of government schools. But I'd prefer a voucher system over what we have now as a method to move us forward. Dave is not moving toward libertarianism by putting restrictions on people that are healthy and nonviolent. If what Dave had said
which he said, by the way, were arbitrary standards.
He did say they were arbitrary, which was ridiculous. Had he said something akin to, look, nobody right now, if he said our goal should be open borders, but we can't get there right now, let's start here, I'd say, okay, I can go for that. But that's not what he said. What he said was, if the people of America don't want others coming in, it's their right to not have them come in. Importantly, because he specifically said he was not making an appeal to popularity or democracy, and I'm taking him at his word. He's arguing in principle that if a majority of people don't want something to happen and you allow it to happen, it's a violation of their rights, their property rights. That's his argument. Very important.
Dave always says he's not arguing for what he in fact is arguing for. That's sort of what he likes to do. But I do think that the federal government, maybe not necessarily federal government, well, the federal government, because it makes immigration, it's pretending that it has control over immigration. But the sanctuary cities and the sanctuary states are placing a moral hazard on the people, the taxpayers, because in essence, many of these immigrants aren't allowed to work. They're prohibited from working by the government edict until they get some kind of hearing, which enables them to get some form of permission to work. And during that time, sanctuary cities and or states are providing them with housing and providing them with other amenities at the expense of the taxpayer. And I could see a lot of people justifiably being miffed at that, because those folks coming in then become a parasitic community. Many of them, because they have to work in order to live, will also start going into underground black market parts of society, which oftentimes involve violence, because they have no other choices left open to them, because we don't have free and open immigration. We don't have free and open market for jobs. All of these things are closed shops, either by labor cartels or by laws that prohibit these people from, making individual deals with employers to work. So there is a moral hazard set up by some of these sanctuary cities that really should be looked at, don't you think?
And yes, and then the argument is, then you get rid of those restrictions on employment. You don't violate your principles. Like Jim Valiant says, we can't change it all without an ideal clearly defined. My method, and I'm an incrementalist, I do not think we could go from here to where I want to be in one day. I don't think it would be effective. I don't think it would achieve the goals I want. But you still have to lay out your ideal, and then you demonstrate how you can get from here to there. That's it just seems like so commonsensical to me. So Alex came prepared with data. Dave said your standard, you're measuring, because Alex made the point that the government tends to grow quicker when there's immigration restrictions than when there's not immigration restrictions. And he presented an abundance of data to prove that. And he had an argument for why. Because when there's immigration restrictions, unions tend to grow. Unions become empowered. And when unions become empowered, the government grows. And he had the empirical evidence.
I would say that that's not the only way.
No,
that's
but
the only way government grows.
Probably not. But the thing is, well, he also got into that what the government ends up having to do in terms of violating the rights of citizens. Alex made all those points. And Dave turned around and said, Alex, as far as I can see from reading his studies, the only criteria he's going by is percentage of GDP. But then Gene Epstein, the host, actually interrupted. And he said, hold on. He said, I know some of these metrics that Alex is referring to. For instance, the Fraser Institute's measure of economic liberty. And he said it's simply not the case that the only criteria Alex is going by is percent of GDP. There was an abundance of, things that I can't recall right now, but they were there. So Dave kind of misrepresented his point of view in that exchange. So all in all, I thought Alex won. We'll get into what the metrics were and whether he won in a second, but I do want to talk about my own question that I got to ask, because they made the announcement. If you want to ask a question, make sure to line up by that microphone. And I'll tell you, anybody that would have been in my way would have been in serious trouble, because I was there. Bang. I was at that microphone. I was the second in line, and only 4 people that got to ask questions, 2 on the bottom, 2 on the top. And I was one of the 2 because I was first there. And my question to both of them was, your argument that both of you have spent the last hour, whatever it is, arguing about whether the federal government should be doing something, but neither one of you have addressed the issue about whether the federal government is authorized to do something. Now, I know a lot of libertarians are hostile to the Constitution. So I said, look, Lysander Spooner notwithstanding, the Constitution is still the law of the land, right? So I asked them, first of all, is the federal government empowered to restrict immigration? And if so, where is it? Dave answered, I'm not a constitutionalist. I'm here arguing for how libertarians should feel about the issue. He said there's some good things about the Constitution, some things bad. But before I get to Alex's answer, let me just state that Dave referenced the people that voted for Donald Trump. Well, the Constitution is the document that allows for the voting to take place. The Constitution is the document by which all these arrangements he's talking about are governed, or at least supposed to be governed, right? So to then just say, and by the way, are you then arguing that there should be that the federal government shouldn't be bound by the Constitution? That we should just throw that away and go by what you feel or what people are going to feel about it? It just didn't seem right to me. But I want to tell you what Alex said, then you get in. Alex actually pulled out a copy of a constitution, a pocket constitution, the same one that I've had for about 20 years. That Cato actually sent me the same constitution when I was in prison. And Alex said, well, I can answer this question. And he said, no. He said the federal government is not authorized to pass immigration laws. It's nowhere in here. It's a usurped authority. It's a usurped power. Of course, and Alex is absolutely right. So I guess that the libertarian, if you're going to argue that they should do it anyway, then your position is that the federal government should not be limited, that they should act arbitrarily based on how you can convince people that they should feel. So I thought Alex knocked the answer out of the park. I thought Dave didn't do a good job with his answer. So go ahead, Mark.
Well, all he did was appeal to demagoguery. He just said, I'm telling libertarians how they should feel about this issue, and it's not even how they should feel, to be honest with you. If they like liberty, they shouldn't be about voluntarism. They should be their core principle should be individual rights. Subby said something here about you, my friend. I've never seen you move so fast in his life. He thought that he was surprised. A hamstring when they asked you to go.
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah. Well, since Subby wants to crack jokes, let me just tell you, they made the announcement at the beginning of the debate. Please, everybody shut off your phones. And we're in the front row. And midway through the debate, I hear this loud ringing and I look, and to my absolute horror, it's my guest. It's over there to the left with his phone ringing off the hook. But anyway, so I personally, my view was Alex won the debate. I think on a technical level, he won the debate. Now, let me just say, I think that Dave is a performer. He's a stand-up comedian, which means he knows how to improv on the fly to play to an audience. And that's not a knock against him. It's what he's good at. He's a good communicator at persuading people with appeals to emotion, with, showing himself, portraying himself as if he's an authority. I don't even know that he does it intentionally. It's just his personality. He has a better voice than Alex, for instance, and a louder voice than Alex, a better stage presence than Alex. So in the end, by the rules, Dave had changed 21% of the audience's minds, and Alex had changed 15%. So Dave won. Now, here's some of my issue with this. As I read through the comments afterwards, one person said, well, once I saw that Alex was reading from a script, I knew he lost. And I'm thinking, well, why? Why does if the point of the debate is to get to truth, why is it a knock against him because he came prepared with his facts written? So that was one thing that really took me aback. Then there was the amount of people who were insulting Alex's appearance, his voice, the fact that he's Jewish, he's this, he's that. They had a lot of very negative things to say about him. And that's when it occurred to me that I've had this happen to me when engaging with some, by no means all, not even a majority, just some of Dave Smith's followers. And that might happen to anybody with a 500,000 followers. You know what I mean? So I'm not putting it specifically on him. I'm just saying that I've had this experience that these kind of people are within his timelines. And then it occurred to me that while I like the Oxford style, and you really don't have a better way to judge it, it occurred to me if people are in a comment section willing to call somebody a dirty Jew, judging him by the fact that he became prepared, making fun of his hairstyle, making fun of his voice, these are not the type of people who would be above lying on a survey. And there's nothing to stop them going in. And I'm not saying this did happen. I'm only saying it could happen, right? There's nothing to stop them from giving the answer at the beginning, oh, I support open borders, when they really don't. And then at the end saying, I've changed my mind. And then you've now tilted the scale. So there's really no way to know who won. I mean, you can know who won technically by the rules of the thing, but I mean, who presented the better arguments. Ultimately, we have to judge for ourselves. And I would say that, there's a couple hundred people in the auditorium, but we don't know how. Last time I checked, 35,000 viewers, and that was this morning. So we don't know ultimately, and this is where I come, as I've just knocked the idea of debates as being performative and, emotional appeals, and you can't know who won. But when you have 35,000 viewers, there's no way for us to know the impact that somebody like Alex can have with his arguments. There's also no way to know the impact that Dave can have. But I think that it does justify making the arguments, engaging in debates, because you never know whom you're going to reach. And just before I kick off and give it to you, I just want to say that at this debate, I met Nick Gillespie, somebody who, one of the high ups at Reason Magazine. I've been reading for decades. That was wonderful. I met Stephan Kinsella, who I've debated several times. I've had him on my show. I debate with him on Twitter. That was nice. Gene Epstein was great. The after party was a very, very good experience with a lot of fun. So overall, I had a great time and great experience, and I would definitely go again. And I would recommend that, anybody that likes debates to go. It's a great time.
I would also urge people to read Jeffrey Tucker's editorial in the Epoch Times about debates and whether or not they actually solve problems or change people's minds, and what it is people really focus on when the debates are happening. I think you brought up a fact that's true of Dave followers. They're not so much focused on the facts at hand. They're not really interested in the truth. They're being convinced. They're sort of there as a tribal support mechanism for their clan. And when you think about debates in general, think about the first presidential debate that ever happened. Do you know who that was between?
Lincoln and Douglas.
No, televised presidential debate.
Oh, that was Kennedy and Nixon.
Kennedy and Nixon. You know, the people who heard the debate, who do you think they thought won?
Yeah, Nixon, and the people who watched thought Kennedy. Nixon was sweating. He didn't have the makeup.
He didn't have the makeup. Yeah. He had shifty eyes. You know, yada yada. There were things, superficial, physical qualities that they focused on over the substance of the ideas. Whereas Kennedy, drug-addled as he was, because he certainly was on drugs to keep his attention up and make him appear healthy and probably keep him focused, had the cooler, calmer demeanor and is supposedly handsome. I've never found Kennedy to be a handsome man, but they can't stop talking about what a handsome dude he was. Anyway, so debates are especially blood sport debates, the one that you engage.
Those are disgusting. Those are ridiculous.
They never really get at the truth. It's just who has the louder voice, who can repeat the same mischaracterizations of your argument in a louder way, and who brings their audience to bear, and who can appeal to the lowest common denominator. And oftentimes debates are not really that elevated. I've seen some very, very, very good ones, but they're rare. I think
it's true. But can I give a counterpoint to that?
Yeah, but
I want to give a counterpoint.
They require great moderation and fairness.
I agree with you, and I'm still going to come out in favor of debates, and here's why. Those type of people, the type of people that you're talking about, that I talked about, that act that way, that level insults anonymously, and are just coming in there not being rational, we're never going to reach them anyways, right? We're not going to reach them. But there are rational, logical people that honestly are in pursuit of truth that listen to debates, and those guys you can reach. And it's worth it. If you've got a situation like in this situation with Dave, that debate, like I said, it was 35,000 last time. Let's say that 10% of those, 10% are rational people. That's still 3,500 people that you're reaching.
They shouldn't do a vote immediately after the debate. They should do a vote 3 days later, after people have had a chance to really listen to the debate, maybe see it a couple of times.
That's an interesting idea.
Yeah. Then I bet Alex wins. I'm going to watch the whole debate because just the few minutes that I saw Alex, I thought he handled it.
He did. And I stole the show. My 30 seconds was the highlight of the evening.
You did. You really did. If anything, because you made Dave admit that he doesn't know anything about the Constitution of the United States. And as a purported leader of a political party, he should know something.
So Scott says Jeffrey Tucker, the man you referenced, was one of the few liberty heroes speaking out about lockdowns in March 2020. So I got an interesting story about Jeffrey Tucker, whom I happen to like, by the way.
Oh, but is this going to be a bad story? Because I love Jeffrey.
No, not really. I mean, it could turn. No, it's good. It's all right. And I probably told you this before. So, I want to answer this question first. Christopher Smith says, what constitutes winning? Being correct objectively or changing opinions? I would say both. I would say that being correct objectively, if you're alone in your bedroom and you're right, I mean, you're still right, but you're trying to change minds. So I think you have to do both. But I think if you change minds and you're wrong, that's horrible. And if you're objectively right, but you're not convincing anybody, then I think it's kind of useless. So Jeffrey Tucker, I had been listening to him for a while. He was on the same talk show that I was on, the Todd Feinberg show. He'd be on once a month or once every 2 weeks. So I would listen to him, and I liked what he had to say. This was, a lot of this stuff happened during COVID. And as Scott said, Jeffrey was great during COVID, and he was on, and he would talk about it. And I, many years before, had read an article called How to Remain Happy in an Unfree Society or something like that. And it's one of these articles that really impacted me. I've read it over and over and over and over and over again to keep my mental well-being in times of crisis. And it turned out one day I looked at the name of the author of the article. It was Jeffrey Tucker. the same guy who's on my friend's show. So I end up, I got out of prison. I interviewed Jeffrey, and I actually interviewed him about the, libertarianism, the history of libertarianism, because he's written an article on it, and he's certainly equipped to comment on the subject. And he gave me some of the best clips I've ever had from my show, when he said that the Mises Caucus should be called instead of calling themselves the meme caucus, the Mises Caucus, they should call themselves the shit post meme caucus, right? And he also said that his teacher, who was Murray Rothbard, he said 3 to 4/5 of his mind were all Ayn Rand. He said, he didn't give her credit in public, but she dominated his thinking. Like, she really dominated his thinking, which I thought was interesting. And if you look in subsequently, you'll see it's correct. Now for the disappointing part of Jeffrey and what you said is, Jeffrey, I think, has taken a populist turn. I think he's still, a liberty-minded guy, but he has changed his mind, unless he's changed it back again, which is possible. But he has changed his mind, and he favors Dave's position on immigration, which is a shame, because Jeffrey's a strong arguer. He's a good writer. So, maybe he came back and I just don't know it, because he was once open borders and then he went to closed borders. So I don't know. But that's my Jeffrey Stuckertory, and I will turn it over to you, Mark.
I like it that you said it was your Jeffrey Suckertory instead of
Jeffrey Suckertory, like suffering succotash. That's my Jeffrey Tucker story.
Oh, well,
don't make fun of me, man.
I read his, hey man, I got to bring you down a little bit, because you became the star of the debate with just asking one question. So I got to bring you back down to earth, baby. Touch grass. I read Jeffrey Tucker's articles every week, his editorials every week, and I don't recall him becoming a pro immigration control guy. Now, it could be based on the nature of the government and the way in which they structure payouts and benefits and subsidies to immigrants that are, of course, unjustifiable. And so he may be reacting pragmatically to that condition, but I haven't seen any evidence of him turning to immigration now. But I could be wrong. I've missed a couple of weeks of his articles, so it's possible. Hey,
he lives in Connecticut, where I live. He doesn't live very far from me either.
Well, let's go knock on his door and say hey. So if I were to ask you a question, I think you can answer it. Let's put ourselves in the minds of people who voted for President Trump, which which he won the popular vote. So a slight plurality of folks voted for him. So let's say he was voted in for very specific reasons. His constituency had very specific values that they wanted enacted in the government. And what would you say those were?
Say that again. I want to make sure I get it.
Trump was elected for reasons.
Yes.
So what reasons do you think Trump was elected for?
Well, these are like, I get that these are like the political questions, but ultimately millions of people voted for him. And there's multiple reasons that people did so.
So let's say the top 2 or 3.
I would say that the main reason he won, I think, is because of whom he was running against. I think that people just are fed up. A lot of people are fed up, for instance, with the woke stuff, with the pronouns and this and that. Kamala was a horrible candidate. The way in which she got the reins with no primary, I think, turned people off. The fact that the media had been lying about Biden, I think, turned people off. So there's a lot of things. There's people that vote based on personality. They just like Trump. But I think that if you really had to get, down to it, I would say, I think the immigration and the economy. Like if I had to really bet on it, I would say immigration and the economy were the top issues.
I would say that was those were the prime motivators as well for people who voted for Trump. Now, with respect to the economy, that means bringing prices down. That means bringing inflation down, which can only be done by cutting the government's spending. That's the only way it can be done. Now, of course, they brought in Doge, which started out as predicting $2 trillion in cuts, went down to 1 trillion, then 150 billion, and then 60 billion to 14 billion. In other words, less than 1% of what they were claiming that they were going to be able to cut is actually in still proposed and not actual cuts. Then they have promised not to touch any of the entitlement programs, which are the prime drivers of our debt. Right. Well, the big beautiful bill has passed the House, and it's now going to the Senate. Now, if you thought Trump was going to cut the expenses of government, cut the swamp, so that our lives would be made much easier, capital wouldn't be flowing to the parasitic political class, but would be flowing to productive people who could make jobs for us and make the country more prosperous, you were wrong. By conservative estimates, this is conservative estimates from the Government Accounting Office, the GOP tax bill will add $2.3 trillion to the deficit. Now, of course, that's just
the CBO, right?
Yeah, that's
the CBOs, because other organizations actually put it at.
That's what it goes even higher. So, so the press secretary is fond of saying all of the wonderful tax cuts that are in there for people, but people have to understand that what goes along with that tax cut, which sounds good, folks, it sounds great. Okay, the federal government will be burdening us less today, but they're burdening us less today to burden us more tomorrow, because that just raises the deficit. Without constant cuts in government spending, they are borrowing money and or printing it in order to pay for the deficits that the tax cuts will create. That means you're not paying now, but you're going to be paying later, and perhaps in a catastrophic sense. Now, the Congressional Budget Office said that the conservative estimate is 2.3 billion, but there were other think tanks that put the deficit at over $5 trillion. Folks, this is an unsustainable series of events. Now, they're saying that the Senate is going to make some real cuts because there are quote unquote fiscal conservatives in the Senate that would like to actually add real cuts to this, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. I don't think there's any political will to do that. And we've seen people protest in the streets whenever there is the slightest hint that an entitlement is going to be cut. What do you think about this? First of all, he's not keeping up his promise. They're doing fancy accounting in order to pretend as if they're,
right. The cuts will come later.
Yeah, the cuts will come after his administration.
Yeah. The cuts will come later when, of course, they're not going to come at all. Milton Friedman made a very good point about this. He said, if you cut taxes, but you don't cut spending, right? You're actually not cutting taxes. You may think you are, but you're not. And the reason is because there's only two ways to pay for the new spending. Either you're going to print money or you're going to raise taxes. If you print money, you're necessarily going to raise prices, and then your tax cuts are wiped out. And if you raise taxes, then of course they're also wiped out. So cutting taxes without doing anything about the debt, it is just, you're not accomplishing what you're claiming. And the deficit is probably going to be more than what they're projecting anyways. And we know that, and anybody with a brain knows it. But I think you asked something earlier, Mark, about if people voted for something, do they have the right to get it? Did I imagine that, or did you ask that?
I might have.
Because the answer is no. You don't have the right to get whatever you vote for. You have the candidate that wins the most votes has the right to be in office. But first of all, let's take the idea that Trump has a massive mandate in the country. He didn't even get 50% of the vote. He got like 49.8 or something close, but not even 50% of the people that voted. Never mind all the people that don't vote, right? So there isn't this massive mandate. Secondly, I don't care what people vote for or what they want. There's limits on that are in the Constitution. I personally think there should be more limits on what they can get, and that the Constitution grants far too many government powers. But what the Constitution says is not based on what Michael Liebowitz happens to, believe or think true. It matters what's in the Constitution. But people don't have the right to violate the Constitution with their vote. just because there's a majority, unless they can amend it, which I haven't seen anything come forward. So no, they don't have that right. And like you said, I mean, it's just more of the same. Trump might bluster, and and there certainly are, I would argue, rights violations taking place. I certainly think that the governmental impact is being seen in a negative way. Doge hardly cut anything, and the supposed cuts in here are never going to happen. So it's just garbage. I mean, I don't know how. I would never have voted for Kamala Harris. I would never vote for Kamala Harris. I wouldn't have voted for Joe Biden. I have long despised Joe Biden. I thought his behavior in the debates with Paul Ryan, I thought it was absolutely grotesque. I thought that him saying, if they win, they want to put y'all back in chains and all that shit, I think was gross demagoguery. I can't stand him. But I don't know how they could have been so much worse than Trump. I don't, the deficit's going up. There's talk of suspending habeas corpus. There's talk of sending American citizens out of the country. There's people are being deported and imprisoned without due process. So you can't just say, oh, well, because they're fond of making the argument. Obama didn't give people due process when he deported them. No, but Obama didn't deport them to a prison. Trump is. And the Fifth Amendment says you can't be deprived of life, liberty, and property without due process. You're now depriving them of their liberty by sending them to a prison. Now, I don't know enough about the intricacies of immigration law to know if deportation should require due process. I just don't know. But I do know that if you're going to imprison somebody, due process is applicable.
Yeah, that seems so to me, but let's not forget that Trump has legal people looking at this and doesn't know what the Fifth Amendment actually is, but I'm sure he believes his legal people do. Let's not also forget that he's made a promise to restart energy and desubsidize the inefficient wind and solar energy companies, but that's not happening either until after his administration is over. So none of the cuts to the energy sector that would free us from this nonsensical, quote unquote, renewable and unreliable source of energy that just tax the grid and make energy more expensive. None of those cuts are going to happen until after he's out of office, which I find inexplicable given his strong energy stance, which seemed to be about opening up fossil fuels again, opening up natural gas production again, opening up nuclear even, re-legalizing nuclear power so that nuclear power can come online as an option over these renewables. But even those subsidies are staying in place. Plus, we have additional funding for the FBI, which Kash Patel was supposed to cut. Additional funding for the Defense Department, which was also supposed to be streamlined and made more efficient, but that's going to rise, be somewhere in the $1 trillion mark. I mean, we have rises everywhere, including what? Now the FAA needing to revamp the entire aviation system of the country at the price of billions upon billions upon billions of dollars, when these airports should be privatized and their safety record should be a part of their selling points, and that would drive them to better technology. Private security would drive them to better protect people, and it would be much more streamlined and efficient. But instead, the American taxpayer is going to take this burden upon himself, along with all these other spending provisions that the Trump administration wants to pull on us. So forget the GOP being the party of middle America, as they've postured themselves to be this election cycle. The one good thing Trump did was he brought the Republican Party into the working class, which was exclusively the realm of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has now become the elitist group of academic elitists and billionaires, and Trump appealed to the blue-collar worker. Well, there's nothing that he's doing in this bill that he's providing in this bill, or that the Republican Congress is providing in this bill, that is going to be good for the American blue-collar worker. If anything, this is going to be an obstacle to your life. It is going to make your life far more expensive, if not now, then down the line when we have to pay this debt, folks, because the chickens always do come home to roost. They always do.
You reminded me of, what was it, Jeremiah Wright, Obama's guy? America's chickens, or whatever he did. He's such a dick. Real quick, I just noticed it's 12:45. I presume you are done leaving us at 12:30 on Thursdays. That's awesome.
Yes, I am. Yes, I am.
Oh, that is fan-freaking-tastic. So Alan Thomas made a good point here, or he brought up a good issue that I didn't send you an article about. It was from the other day, when he says that DHS Secretary Kristi Noem could not answer the question accurately about what habeas corpus is. What did you think of that?
Oh, I didn't see that. Do tell.
So, okay. That's entertain the audience. You're a good-looking guy with a lot of experience. Just entertain them and let me pull up the exact quote.
Well, first of all, they take every opportunity to put Kristi Noem on television, whether she knows what she's talking about or not. There's a reason for that. She's got good TVQ. She looks like a television star. She's sort of hot, in my opinion, and so I think they hope that the American public are just going to be sort of transfixed by her physical characteristics and ignore everything else that she's saying that violates the Constitution and rule of law in America. But I'm not surprised that a conservative of today's ilk doesn't know what habeas corpus is.
Oh, this is funny. I just have to find the exact quote because it's freaking great. Okay, so there's the question. I found it. So the question is this: Maggie Hassan, yes, asked Kristi Noem, what is habeas corpus? Here's her answer. Well, habeas corpus is a constitutional right that the president has to be able to remove people from this country and suspend their right to. And then she was interrupted. No, that's incorrect. Habeas corpus, and then it gets into what it actually is. But the fact that the head of the Department of Homeland Security thinks that habeas corpus is the president's right to deport.
Well, it sounded like she was saying habeas corpus is the thing the president has the right to suspend. So that's disturbing in and of itself. Now, look, I don't know what to deal with first: this Daily Economy article about local control, fake or real, or the Jacobin article, because maybe we'll deal with the Jacobins first, because sure. These guys drive me absolutely insane. How do you
send them to you?
Guys? Huh?
That is why I send them to you.
Oh, you just want to drive me insane?
Yes.
Yes. Well, yeah. One of the things I hate is not that I'm a writing expert, folks, but I do think there's such a thing as good writing and bad writing, and the difference between the two. When you're trying to communicate abstract points like political points, you make the abstract point and then you follow it up usually with concrete examples in order to illustrate how your abstract point applies to reality. And that's how you clearly communicate with people. Well, in the Jacobin today, there's an article called "Capitalism is Changing, but Not into Neo-Feudalism." Now, I personally didn't know what the fuck this guy was talking about 90% of the time. Okay, other than to quibble about what feudalism means, and it's turning into a different kind of feudalism, which he had a very difficult time concretizing. So it was an article in the abstract all the way through about various definitions of feudalism and how what we're seeing today with the techno world is a type of feudalism that we haven't seen before, because its features are slightly different than medieval feudalism, but it's still nonetheless a type of private fiefdom that these techno guys like Elon Musk and Bezos are setting up, whereby they become rent collectors, more or less, setting up private law, private governments that they then use in order to maintain monopoly power. A very Marxist perspective of what's going on with respect to big tech. Now, I wanted to say that it was as if these people don't understand that the regulatory state is what creates regulatory capture. It was from the very first time the regulatory state happened in the 1880s with the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission. That commission was created by the trusts, the railroad trusts, would get together and they would try to regulate prices amongst themselves to keep prices high, to keep freight prices high. Inevitably, somebody would break with the trust and lower prices and end up capturing the market. And they couldn't stand the fact that somebody was responding to the market. They wanted to keep it as high, the prices as high as possible and keep out competition. So they instituted the government to do this for them and to regulate them through the Interstate Commerce Commission. Now, of course, this creates regulatory capture, because who does the Interstate Commerce Commission tap to make the regulations but industry people? And usually the people aren't mom and pop industries. They're the big folks in the industry that come in and then regulate. They set up regulations that have executive and legal power that then create rules for the entirety of the industry. Now, oftentimes those rules are set up specifically to enhance the monopoly power of these particular businesses. So you'll get institutions like Amazon, of course, arguing for a minimum wage. Why? Because capital poor startup companies who can't afford a $20 minimum wage are going to be knocked out of competition. And so the regulatory capture winds up creating a sort of coercive monopoly. Now, that's not an effect of capitalism. Marxism thinks that there's an iron law of monopoly, whereby monopolies are a natural effect of capitalism, and they're not. They're a natural effect of a mixed economy where the state can regulate, in other words, have preemptive controls over businesses, and so businesses are incentivized to bribe the politicians in their favor, which is exactly what lobbyists do. It's as if these communists don't recognize that little problem, because their solution is to do more of the same, to create more regulation, to have a heavier state intervention in the private enterprise. Now, do you think that these techno giants are creating internal fiefdoms where they are essentially feudalistic lords in their own little areas where they call all of the shots politically?
No. And I generally don't think, like, the author of the article made the claim that they basically want to subdue the populace and implement their control. Not just that they want to make money, but the thing is, I found the article to be largely incoherent as well, Mark. But there were a couple things that I did glean from it. One is there's this implicit idea of determinism, that capitalism, and it's a Marxist idea that capitalism is unfolding and developing and going in this direction. Human beings are not cogs. We're beings with volition who can change our minds, who can grow, we can learn. So there's nothing there's no direction in which we're necessarily going to go. Things can change. That's the first thing. The other thing is this idea that these people see everything in terms of class, right? The poor, the rich, you're here. This is the slave class. This is the feudal class. I don't know. I grew up poor, and I didn't walk around thinking about my class and, oh my God, I'm in a lower class. Now, I was not happy with the violence that was around me, or the neglect that I often dealt with, but it wasn't a matter of class. And certainly there's rich kids that suffer, are in violent homes. I didn't suffer abuse, but they, may suffer abuse, or there might be alcoholism in the home. So it's just the focus on class, I think, is just a smokescreen. I don't think it's something that is really important. I don't think it vitally distinguishes people or fundamentally distinguishes people from one another. And then when he talked about making progress, he talked about whether it's real socialism or some kind of a progressivism. That's not progress. That's regress. That's going backwards. That's going backwards to the idea that the government should control us, whether it be the kings and the queens or the proletariat or the dictator or whomever. That's going backwards. And that was my main takeaway from the article. A lot of it was just a lot of incoherent dribble. Subby points out here, Mark, just to let you know so you can remind me, that there was a guy at the debate last night who I think he hosts a podcast. His name was Ryan. He's a big fan of yours and would like to interview you. Remind me after, and I'll get you the details of the guy.
Okay, cool. So Ray says, that's why I don't like using the term working class. I just say wage earner. But I have to say, these are appropriate classifications. There is a poor, there is a middle class, and there is a upper class. But in America, they're not stagnant. There's no glass ceiling. They're not places that determine your existence. In medieval times, you were an artisan. You were an artisan for generations upon generations upon generations. There was no way that you could burst out of your status, your economic status. In America, that's not the case. I started out in lower middle class and have achieved more than anyone in my family as a result of being in a place that enabled me to realize my dreams as much as I am capable of realizing them. So in America, classes are temporary stations that you lodge at. In fact, the greatest turnover in class is in the upper classes. In the wealthy get poor much faster, and the poor get richer much faster. And in an economy where people are left free to pursue the values that they want to pursue, that they're able to pursue, there are literally no limits upon you. And a class is only a temporary transition from one economic stage to another. And there's no guarantee that you're going to remain in a particular class. You can achieve wealth. And this is an American story of people who've become millionaires 4 or 5 times. They've become millionaires, multimillionaires, lost it, gained it all back again, re-lost it, gained it all back again. I mean, that's an American story. Look, freedom is it's a beautifully dangerous place to be, because you risk a lot, but you also gain a lot. And with no risk, there's no real reward. So I still like to use those terms. I just don't think they're deterministic terms.
They are not, and they're also not fundamental. In race, what I meant to post just now is it isn't there. What came out is it isn't threat. So I meant it isn't there. All right, Mark, you ready to take us out? It's definitely your turn for the capitalist quote of the day. There's no wiggling out of this one.
I never wiggle out.
No, you try though. You do.
No.
Little excuses.
It's only fake. That's fake. That's fake news, my friend. So look, guys. Here's the choices you're left with in the establishment. You're left with a party that pretends to be for working class Americans, that pretend to be removing government obstacles, and be for the classical liberal ideal, who is not actually for that. They're just another statist group attempting to pull the wool over your eyes. And you have the other side, the left, who isn't trying to pull the wool over your eyes. They just think the state is entitled to everything that you own and to control you from the bottom up. Capitalism is not that. It does not agree with those narratives, either of those narratives. Capitalism creates a system where you are free. Now, I heard Jon Stewart talking in his interview with Nick Gillespie, where he thought people were limited in their freedom because of their economic class. Because you're poor, you're limited in your choices. Now, that's true, but that's not a limited freedom. Freedom, liberty, as we call it, is a political ideal, and what you are free from in a country that respects liberty is force. Only other people can make you unfree. Your starting situation cannot make you unfree. You are still free, no matter how poor your initial state, to rise, provided other people do not prevent you from doing that. That's what capitalism does. It creates a world in which other men are barred from using force against you, so that you are free to rise. And if you cannot rise, if you are one of those rare folks that are in a position where you are physically or mentally disabled to the degree that you cannot help yourself, the capitalist system enables people with resources to be able to help you and to be stand-ins for you, and to give you more values than you get from a state that takes capital from productive uses and then uses it for other means. So Look, capitalism is a system of total and absolute unfettered freedom. That doesn't mean there's no regulation. People still have to regulate their own lives. Private enterprises would look out for your interests too, and those with the best reputations would rise to the top. And you would still have to inform yourself with respect to what you pursue, but you have full moral agency to do that. Capitalism doesn't allow drift. It doesn't allow mental drift. It compels you to be morally clear and mentally clear in every choice that you make, and that's healthy for you psychologically. So, hey, man, capitalism all the way. It's good for your mind. It's good for your body. It's good for your overall well-being. It's good for society.
And it'll be good for our ratings and the algorithms if you hit that like button.
Yes, please hit the like button. We will be back here tomorrow, same bat time, same bat place. That's 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 p.m. Eastern time. We'll be.
I hate that you say Pacific first.
Well, because that's where I am.
You're on the Pacific, I know, but don't you understand? I'm on the East Coast, and I feel that should take priority.
I do, but since you are the co-chair, I have to put you sort of second. You're co-pilot. So you
fair enough.
So we'll be here tomorrow. We'll be talking about news items, but be sure to bring your questions, folks, because Friday is Q&A day. That means bring us your capitalist questions. Bring us your communist questions. If there's any commies in the audience, please bring us your questions. We want to have confrontations with you, friendly confrontations, but confrontations nonetheless, because your ideas need to be confronted and refuted. In order for us to be free. So folks, until tomorrow, please remember, always check your premises. We'll see you tomorrow. Peace.